home that we moved in Urbana. She was buying on contract. When I got her the new house, a church wanted to buy the property. She thought she only owed $3,000 on it, and
so she could sell to the church,
yes.
get the $3,000, pay it off, and
when the owner of the property realized that she had moved, he sued for $6,000. My mother said I didn't owe him $6,000. We went into court. He said, "Yes, ma'am, you owe me $6,000 due to back taxes." Her record said she only owed $3,000. The judge actually cried with my mother and told my mother, "Well, Mrs. Johnson, you owe the man $6,000." My mother didn't have $6,000, so she simply vacated the property. Yeah.
And then what happened?
The property was sold to the church.
For $15,000?
For $15,000. All my mother wanted was $8,000. But I think that when I started looking at who owned what in Northeast Champaign, that experience with my mother was facing a lot of people.
They thought they owned homes.
Yes.
They were buying them on contract, but when the crunch came, they discovered that they owed
did not
more.
own the property.
They did not own the property, and they owed more than they thought they owed, and they really weren't close to owning the property.
65% of what we call Northeast Champaign, up until 1975, was owned by absentee landlords. And when you were walking around, or when I was walking around, talking about the need to develop new housing strategies and to use what programs were available, primarily urban renewal, scattered site public housing, Section 8 housing, there were a lot of citizens who protested against those strategies because you were taking their properties. Generally, you're taking our homes. And it was very difficult to explain to them, "Ma'am, you don't own this home. In fact, we don't even own this neighborhood." I'm still criticized today by a lot of people who feel that what I've done is destroy their neighborhood and result in them being located someplace that they know nothing about, taking property that they owned. But we didn't own the damn thing. You know, we did not own it. It was, in fact, owned by absentee people who was...
Well, what's the situation now? At one point you say, what, 1975, 65% of the housing in Northeast Champaign was, so far as you could tell, from looking at the deeds and the abstracts, actually owned by absentee landlords. Maybe people thought they were buying it on contract, maybe they were, but the deeds were still held by someone else. What's the situation now?
Well, as a result of City of Champaign's community development efforts, that 90% of that neighborhood is now in the hands of the people who live there.
90%?
90% of that neighborhood, excluding the multifamily housing, which is there, Mount Olive Manors, Bradley Park Apartments, and public housing. So now, really, that's significant. But
so there you are as a kid, kind of looking at the struggle of your family to own your own home, to finally have some space, and gradually you discover that your family's not alone, the whole community faces the same problem, and then somewhere or other you start learning about government programs and about ways that you can begin to do things that make it more possible for people to own homes.
Well, you know, the problem that I had, the lady asked me this question 15 years ago. She said, "John Lee, why do you have so many organizations?" You know, I had the Concerned Citizens Committee, several housing committees, 5 youth programs, 2 cultural programs. You know, every time I saw a problem, I organized a program for it. And I told her that the problems facing the poor are not single. The moment that you get into the problems of housing, that leads you to employment, that leads you to recreation, that leads you to education, that leads you on and on and on.
Well, let's in fact illustrate exactly how that works. For example, let's talk about housing. If you do indeed find a family with substandard housing and manage to place them in a decent home, then what's the next problem for them?
Well, you have to make sure that they're able to pay for it.
In other words, they could live in substandard housing with a substandard income.
Yes.
But now if you try to put them in...
carry them to standard housing, and their fixed incomes will not allow them to pay for it.
And fixed reminds us that some of the people you're talking about are elderly.
Some are elderly, some are not elderly, but yet they're living on fixed incomes. And Champaign and Urbana has such a poor housing option. There are very few housing choices facing people in the city, particularly the permanent residents. Because this city hasn't built, for example, Champaign hasn't built a public housing unit in over 15 years. So if you cannot see or use public housing as a public housing strategy, I think one of the major political problems in our community is that both city councils, Champaign and Urbana, have historically fought the use of public housing as a legitimate housing tool. And recently, Champaign has opposed Section 8 housing as a housing alternative. So when you're looking at the fact that available standard housing is going into the student market, we're building apartments. So what does a lady do with 4 children or 5 children? There are no units for her. And if you find a situation where you got 10 houses in a row on a block and they're all substandard, and an average household of 5 people, where do you put these people? You know, it's not an easy question to answer.
No, people always hate to move. On the other hand, if you allow neighborhoods to remain like that, you will never have any improvement. You're sort of permanently stuck with substandard housing.
But there's byproducts from that.
Yes.
The byproducts are crime. The byproducts is ignorance. You know, there are all other kinds of destabilizing factors which occur in a neighborhood as a result of substandard conditions. And most people don't see this or understand it.
So what's happened to you, really, if we could sum it up, is that you grew up seeing certain needs, and as you begin to go past the first things you see, you find more and more, and they do tie together, and ultimately you end up forming organizations to deal with it. Well, your mother had this sense that you were going to be a preacher. Tell me what happened to you as you got out of high school. Okay, you graduated from high school, you're 18 years old, you can see that your community needs
I didn't graduate from high school.
You didn't graduate from high school? What did you do?
I left when my class left. I thought I did. There was a problem. When I left Champaign, I had civics, and when I went to Urbana, they gave me civics. They claimed I duplicated the class, and I was a half a credit short. And they wanted me to go to summer school. I went before the Board of Education, pleading ignorance and administrative failures, and because they made me take the course, I didn't take it. And they said there's nothing that we'll do about it. So I didn't get my high school diploma. But I did have 6 scholarships in art. I should have been an artist. But I decided that I would be a politician instead. I don't know how it happened. I did not wake up and say to myself, John Lee, what you need to do is stand on corners and shout at people about those things that you think are problems. I didn't decide to do that.
But it just happened?
It just happened.
Were you already doing it to some extent before you got out of high school? What were you?
Basically, when I was in high school, most of the problems involved young people. We did not have major gang problems. Although we lived in a ghetto, we didn't recognize it as a ghetto. It was simply our neighborhood.
Yeah.
You know. Then I realized that people needed help. And for some reason, people just constantly said, go get John Lee Johnson. You know, and,
so you were identified as a problem solver?
I went to jail maybe 3 times a week, interfering with the duties of a police officer, in quotes.
No kidding.
Yes. I used to see cops beat people in the head, you know, drag them down the streets. I'd step in and say, I'll arrest this man. You know, I'll effect a citizen arrest. You don't have to do that to him. As a result of that, I was arrested for interfering with the duties of a police officer. I would stand on a corner, and a cop would pull up and just start beating the man, and I would say, you don't have to do that. I'm arrested for exciting a riot. Yeah. So, and you try to explain to people that a lot of the arrest does not represent necessarily that the person is guilty of anything. You know. Of course, a citizen has to go into court of law and prove that what the cop accused him of, he's not guilty of. But most of my arrests occurred in that manner. You know.
So you'd already been arrested numerous times before you even got out of high school?
Yes.
Well, then it must have been clear to you that something needed to be done.
Well, you know, it's funny.
I mean, a town in which a guy gets arrested that frequently has got some kind of problem.
But I was never discriminated against. I never felt discriminated against.
In other words, you knew they were arresting you for what you were doing,
yes,
which didn't fit into their view of the way people were supposed to behave, but it wasn't because you were black particularly. I
was labeled in the Champaign Police Department as a loudmouth. You know. Only one time as a kid, I was walking down the street, coming from high school, and it was a lovely day. And there was an old fellow outside working in his garden. Me and Roy Williams was together that day. He says, it looks like it's going to rain, doesn't it? And we said, what? He said, I see these 2 black spots. And that was the only time as a kid that someone said something to me out of the way. You know.
What did you do? Did you laugh?
Just looked at him and laughed.
Well, I would think you'd have to.
Just looked at him and laughed.